The man with glasses and the brown-haired executive both stared at him in surprise. Folding his hands confidently, the chairman said he was very close to the owner of Fantasy Investments. The chief secretary hesitated and said that CEO Sion was no ordinary man and knew the true value of his dollars better than anyone. The chairman smiled wider and said Sion was only a manager, not the owner. Several people froze, mouths slightly open, exchanging suspicious glances. The chairman asked why they were starring and told them not to overthink it, saying it wasn't his money anyway, and asked where he would even get that many dollars since his own pockets were empty. A gray-haired man touched his chin while Hatch stepped back silently. The chairman slammed his palm on the table and ordered everyone out, warning them not to speak to anyone about his instructions and to follow them precisely. One by one, the men in suits exited through the wooden doors. The chairman folded his hands and looked at Hatch, who bowed deeply and left. As he exited, he glanced sideways thoughtfully. The chairman smiled faintly. Downstairs, several men in suits descended the steps, chatting cheerfully. The protagonist sat on a red sofa watching them, nodding how animated they were, sipping drinks through straws. He thought it strange, since this was supposed to be an emergency meeting about countermeasures for a crisis, yet no one looked worried. He wondered if it was because Xinjiang Group dominated the economy and still had overwhelming financial power. The chairman approached him with open arms and a bright smile. The protagonist asked what he was so happy about, rolling his eyes internally and jokingly thinking they might have chosen him as successor, immediately dismissing the thought as impossible. Yahello suddenly asked whether the protagonist was the owner of Fantasy Investments. The protagonist pressed his lips together and stared silently at his grandfather. Sitting down across from him, the chairman said that today they would speak not as grandfather and grandson, but as owner to owner. The protagonist asked why so suddenly and joked that it was frightening. The chairman smirked and said not to pretend, since curiosity was written all over his face. Looking away, the protagonist thought it wasn't his expression but his grandfather that was the problem. He reminded himself that negotiations belonged to the one with leverage, and while neither side seemed to have it openly, both held hidden cards. He knew his own card but not his opponent's, which made his grandfather's calm expression unsettling in the face of an approaching currency crisis. Leaning back in a chair, the chairman asked whether the money for the AIN Group acquisition was prepared. The protagonist touched his chin and asked what was being planned, saying the funds could simply be transferred from an overseas account. Smiling, the chairman said they were naturally in dollars. The protagonist's eyes widened as he understood everything. His grandfather needed dollar reserves before the crisis hit. He confirmed that the funds were in an American bank. The chairman raised his hand and asked him to exchange them, specifically 1.2 trillion 200 billion won. The protagonist confirmed calmly, stating that at the current rate of 1,201 won per dollar, it amounted to $1 billion. The chairman suggested doing it tomorrow. The protagonist's expression shifted as he laughed lightly and said he didn't want to. Shock spread across the chairman's face as he asked what he meant. With his eyes closed, the protagonist replied that there was no reason to complicate things, since he could simply transfer the money directly to the creditor bank and avoid exchange altogether. The chairman's eyes widened as he asked if that was truly possible. The protagonist smiled and confirmed it, adding that he had eyes and ears and could clearly see the dollar's relentless rise. He said that the merger of Xinjiang and AIN Motors should be completed first, with creditor authorization signed before payment, and that paying later would only benefit him. The chairman continued to stare at his grandson in disbelief, as the protagonist calmly concluded that delaying payment was not disadvantageous for him at all. He studied his grandfather carefully, wondering if he had pushed too hard. Yahello suddenly chuckled, lifting his head and laughing loudly, declaring that everything was exactly as expected from his grandson and that he was becoming more interesting. The protagonist watched him calmly, thinking that his grandfather was still a snake buying time with laughter. Smiling, Yahello offered 1,500 won per dollar. The protagonist told him to try again. Gritting his teeth, the chairman raised it to 1,600. The protagonist said he wasn't interested. Annoyed, the chairman reminded him that all those dollars originally came from land he had donated. The protagonist replied calmly that it was a deal. As a child, he studied hard, scored perfect grades, brought joy to his grandfather, and received land in return. Though the land was worth tens of millions, the joy he gained was worth it. He said it was a smart deal. The chairman snapped irritably that a few $100 million was pocket change to him. Covering his eyes, he called his grandson poisonous and asked how he even remembered such things. The protagonist smiled and said it was his grandfather who brought it up 10 years ago. The chairman sighed, saying he seemed to be giving in, then told him to name his price. The protagonist shifted slightly and said the scales were unbalanced. He was buying dollars that would soon be worth more than gold with one that would become worthless paper. He told his grandfather to put something else on the scale. The chairman asked if he really thought the one would fall that far. The protagonist replied that if money couldn't buy dollars, it was no different from toilet paper. The chairman's eyes widened. He slammed his fist on the table and pointed forward. The protagonist wondered if he had gone too far. Seeing his grandfather so worried made his heart ache, and for a moment he considered offering a small amount of support, then snapped himself out of it. Yahello tapped the table and asked how he knew there would be a dollar shortage. The protagonist said he learned it from the press. The chairman scoffed, saying the media exaggerated everything. The protagonist replied that truth was like poetry, often ignored even when written by Nobel Prize winners. The chairman admitted that truth was powerful but unreadable to most, then asked what he should put on the scale. The protagonist stayed silent, thinking carefully. He reminded himself that Senyang was already drowning and that he held the life jacket. When fear peaked and gold was thrown away, that was when he would offer salvation. Opening his eyes, he answered that merger ratio negotiations should be placed on the table. The chairman shouted that his grandson had a black soul. The protagonist replied that it was a reasonable request, not greed. The chairman accused him of smearing his words with oil, calling it obvious greed. The protagonist asked whether there was anyone in the world without greed and whether business wasn't about satisfying desires. The chairman leaned back, saying greed would always be criticized, so he would simply be very greedy. Smiling, he called his grandson respectable, correcting himself to say respectable grandson. The protagonist reminded him of the joy he brought as a child and the fortune he later saved. The chairman shouted that he had given him far more. He boasted that since unifying Senyang, no one dared oppose him. Even fire itself couldn't take what belonged to him. The protagonist wondered if the 70-year-old man truly still burned with rivalry. The chairman laughed, saying he wasn't taking but sharing, and proposed a confrontation between grandfather and grandson. The protagonist realized he wouldn't get anything through goodwill now. The chairman confidently said he would determine the merger ratio himself, and that what he offered might exceed what his grandson could gain by fighting. No grandfather would be stingy with his grandson. The protagonist stared silently, then smiled and said that as a respectable grandson, how could he rob his grandfather of joy? The chairman smiled, satisfied, and despite that, the protagonist rejected the proposal with a confident grin. The protagonist asked calmly what the second option would be. The gray-haired man looked at him seriously and replied that it was not really an offer at all, that this was usually called a threat. He added that once he moved forward, the boy would regret rejecting the first proposal. Squinting slightly, the protagonist felt confused. He had never truly been threatened before, and he wondered what kind of threat this even was. Folding his hands and closing his eyes, Yang Chao stated that since the proposal had been rejected, there would be no merger between Sang Motors and Ain Motors. The protagonist's eyes widened. Smirking, the old man continued, saying that President Dio would hold a press conference the next morning and announce that Fantasy, which had acquired Ain Group, made unreasonable demands, causing the merger to fail. He would apologize publicly for disturbing the people. The protagonist stared at his grandfather in silence. Then he coldly told him to continue. Calm and confident, he said this was a very weak threat. The old man's face twisted in shock and disbelief as he asked what he meant. The protagonist kept staring calmly. Annoyed, the chairman shouted that if the acquisition failed, he would interfere however he pleased, and that the boy was being frivolous about acquiring the company. The protagonist looked away, thinking something was deeply wrong. He wondered if his grandfather believed that without the merger, Ain Group could not be taken over. Turning back, he said that since the merger was the first condition of the acquisition, the situation had indeed changed, and now it was a real emergency. The chairman looked genuinely shaken. He then declared that there was one thing that would never change. When asked what that was, the veins in his neck bulged as he said that his influence would remain constant. If the merger was canceled, he could call the creditors, the banks, the Blue House, even the National Assembly, and stop the takeover. He asked if the terms would then be reconsidered. Calmly, almost indifferently, he looked away and said that in the current situation, influence no longer worked the same way. He explained that the government had already injected $11 billion into the foreign exchange market, and the rate was still skyrocketing. Korea's usable foreign reserves were only $2 billion, and even the deputy prime minister had publicly admitted they were seeking loans from friendly nations. The chairman stared, stunned, as the protagonist said that influence had not weakened, it had disappeared. Everyone was struggling to survive, and no one would answer calls anymore. He told his grandfather to take the situation far more seriously. He added that it didn't matter whether influence worked or not anymore. In fact, it was better this way because there would be no competing bets. Fantasy's bet would be the only one. He asked whether creditors would still favor Sang Group if it tried to buy Ain for 1.2 trillion won and ended up completely drained. With a calm smile, he said the chairman of Daehin Group must already be clutching his chest. The chairman raised his hand to interrupt, but the protagonist told him to listen. He said his grandfather was hoping this emergency would be corrected soon, but that hope was just desire. Calmly, with quiet certainty, he stated that this crisis would not pass and that the country would not escape it. The chairman listened in silence as the protagonist explained that people believed a nation like Korea could not collapse so easily, and that belief suppressed fear. But when collapse does not come quickly, anxiety grows even worse. The chairman asked if his confidence was truly unshakable. The protagonist replied that something unimaginable would happen in the coming days. Korea's foreign reserves were $2 billion, and he personally held half of that. When that money entered the country, banks and corporations would line up at Fantasy's door. Smirking, the chairman said that if the boy wanted to see him, he would need to take a number. The protagonist calmly replied that his grandfather was already number 0. Silence filled the room. The chairman finally smiled and said he needed to call Hatch and reconsider. The protagonist noticed that for the first time, his grandfather was stepping back. He said he was bored and wanted to finish the acquisition quickly. When asked if something was more important than this, he replied that he needed to shake the dollars in his hand and choose which company to put in his cart. Slowly, realization dawned on the chairman's face. He asked how many dollars the boy had. The protagonist said he could not show his wallet, but he was confident he could swallow Wang Motors as well. He explained that he planned to unite Ain Motors and Wang Motors, and if Sang Motors was added, it would rival Diane Motors. Smiling, he called it another gift to his grandfather. He said he would wait for the second proposal, but time was short. The chairman smiled, saying the threat still felt weak, and calmly that nothing was over until it was over and reminded him those were his own words. He added that now, those words were no longer nonsense. The chairman burst into laughter, while later, alone, he sat tapping the table, troubled. He thought about the foreign exchange crisis and remembered his grandson's words. For the first time, fear truly took hold. He summoned department heads and issued emergency orders, demanding all export earnings be stored in dollars, foreign investments canceled regardless of penalties, and overseas bids lowered to secure immediate payments. Panic filled the room as sweat ran down faces. When asked if he had spoken to the Fantasy owner, the chairman confirmed it, admitting that even during the war he had not been this afraid. He declared that the one with dollars was strong. That night, preparations began. On November 19, 1997, the Deputy Prime Minister declared confidence in handling the crisis without the IMF. 2 days later, he publicly requested IMF assistance. The next day, a presidential address confirmed it. This marked the beginning of the IMF era. The stock index collapsed, credit ratings fell, banks were suspended, conglomerates went bankrupt, and signs were torn down across the country as the economy collapsed like falling Jenga blocks. The mirror-style building reflected the bright rays of the sun. Speaking sharply into his phone, he ordered them to pay for the takeover only after the merger was completed and told them to reread the agreement carefully. The deadline was February next year, which meant there was still plenty of time. His irritation flared as he asked why payment had to be made in dollars. He said he would give them 1.2 trillion won in cash, 10,000 won bills if necessary. He slammed the phone down and leaned back. When June asked if it was about Jail Bank, Sahan replied that chaos was spreading everywhere. He frowned at his nephew and asked how things had gone and whether Chairman Yang Chao was still hesitating. June flipped through a magazine and smiled, saying it didn't look like the old man was planning to give in since he was too stubborn. Sahan crossed his arms and grinned. He added that if his nephew matured a little more, he would never give in to anyone either. He remarked that June was trying too hard to extract more from his grandfather. If the exchange rate rose further and hit 2,001 per dollar, Sahan joked. June replied calmly that he would be grateful, because then his 3 trillion won would become 5. Sahan rested his head on his hand and said that was exactly his point. Having 5 trillion won at the age of 20 was abnormal, so he was curious how it felt. June smiled and told him not to get too excited. He said he wanted to take that money and enjoy life as an aristocrat somewhere in Europe. Sahan looked at him in surprise and said that was actually possible. June asked which sounded better, being the chairman of a Korean conglomerate meddling in government affairs or a rich European aristocrat. Sahan replied sadly that both sounded boring. June smiled and told him to wait a little longer, saying he would become chairman himself and make sure Sahan enjoyed retirement like a European noble. Sahan shaded his eyes with his palm and agreed. As the sun set, the massive corporate building was buried in orange light. One department head stood before Yang Chao and vowed to succeed and repay his kindness. The chairman crossed his arms and told him to stop flattering him and focus on securing $2 billion instead. The man bowed and left. Hack stood quietly, watching the chairman. After a moment, he asked if Yang Chao could tell him who the owner of Fantasy was so he could try negotiating cooperation. The chairman replied gloomily that it wasn't necessary and said he would handle it himself. He ordered Hack to visit the opposition camp and deliver vitamins along with a message that if they provided $2 billion, the Federation of Korean Industries would actively cooperate with the next administration. Hack bowed and left. Alone, Yang Chao opened a black folder on the table and began reading numerical reports. 17.7%. That was the maximum share that could be allocated to Saying Motors. He thought about trading that influence not for $1 billion, but for a favorable exchange rate. He remembered his grandson's dark grin and recalled June saying he would bring everything back to Saying Group after the merger. But he knew that was unlikely. Yang Chao leaned back and sighed, thinking that 17.7% was not the end for June but only the beginning. If that calculating boy truly targeted Saying Group, the rest of his children would be pushed aside. He rubbed his neck and muttered that despite everything, June still had a big heart, judging by how he treated his father. Still, now was not the time to think about family. The group came first. He looked out the window and consoled himself that if the company was ever taken, at least it would be by blood. The office darkened as lamps flickered on. Elsewhere, Sahin reviewed company lists with June, explaining which firms were the most reliable. June asked which was best from an accounting perspective. Sahin pointed to the top entries, nodding profitability and technology but saying those weren't the only factors. June chuckled thoughtfully. Sahin asked whether Daya Construction would collapse. June replied calmly that only Sang and Diane groups could survive on their own. The rest were like candles in the wind. Sahin argued that Daya only needed minimal government support. June stood, hands in pockets, and said they would see. Later, riding through the city at night, June reflected that after the IMF crisis of 1997, Korea had entered an era of natural selection. Predators would bare their teeth and tear apart the weak. He waited at a crosswalk watching people pass, thinking that since he had decided to become king of this place, there was no room for mercy. Yunak interrupted his thoughts, informing him that Hansung Daily had been tailing him. June was surprised. He had assumed enemies were internal. Yunak explained that the chairman already knew and had ordered everyone to pretend ignorance. That worried June. His grandfather never made meaningless decisions. At the mansion, June arranged a dinner for the strategic department and exited the car with a satisfied grin, thinking his sister-in-law's map had been useful. Inside, Yang Chao asked if the offer was enough. June studied the document showing 17.7%. He smiled and asked whether this was a deal or an inheritance. Yang Chao laughed and asked if his greed had no end. He said inheritance was for children, not grandchildren. June replied that his father wasn't like him, so expectations were low. Yang Chao smiled and called that good. He then ordered June to stamp the agreement and transfer $1 billion. June hesitated, knowing another push could shatter everything. He finally agreed, stating he would prepare $1 billion at an exchange rate of 1,601. Yang Chao was surprised. June teased him, asking if he truly believed the torment would stop there. Yang Chao warned the rate might reach 2001 and June would lose heavily. June pretended to worry, then relaxed, saying he wasn't petty enough to bankrupt his grandfather. June revealed 2 requests and placed a map on the table: government land. He wanted to buy it cheaply. Yang Chao exploded, refusing outright. June suggested funding an election campaign so his uncle could become mayor and approve the sale. The chairman roared in fury. June calmly argued that selling land during an economic crisis would face no resistance. When Yang Chao shouted again, June demanded to know why he was so against it. The answer was simple and devastating. Because the mayor was Jin. He was Choi. Silence filled the room as June understood. Political ambition, exposure, and buried crimes. If politics turned hostile, Saying Group would be torn apart. June finally saw the line his grandfather would never cross. He thought about his aunt and uncle, and how his grandfather had already realized that his aunt was using force to demand Sang Group shares equal to his son's, or even more. June looked carefully at his grandfather and asked whether he had considered turning his uncle into a puppet of Sang Group. Seeing the surprise on the chairman's face, June immediately explained. Once his uncle sat in the mayor's chair and soul, dirt, and dust would naturally cling to him. If you grab onto that, you can control him completely. Yang Chao replied that this dirt would come from Sang itself, and if it were exposed, the company would suffer as well. June's eyes sharpened as he calmly said that he would be the one to throw that dirt and dust, and then grab his uncle by the collar so his grandfather wouldn't have to worry. Yang Chao was taken aback by the pressure. June added that he would also provide the money himself, and his grandfather could use it however he wished. Yang Chao stared at his grandson and asked why, if he was even providing the money, he needed permission at all. June grinned, forming his fingers into a tube, and said that if his grandfather made a single call to the opposition party leader, his uncle wouldn't even be nominated. He raised 2 fingers and explained that just 2 steps would keep his uncle in the sole mayor's seat for 8 years, more than enough time to take everything they needed. Yang Chao folded his arms and asked what the second step was. June smiled and said Daya Construction. The chairman's eyes widened. June calmly explained that blocking government subsidies to Daya construction would be enough. Yang Chao objected, saying Daya was no small rural shop, but fifth in subcontractors. June replied casually that compared to Ain Group and Sayang Motors, Daya was nothing more than a kiosk. Yang Chao fell silent, then smiled faintly and said June wasn't asking for Sang construction but planning to take Daya itself. June frowned, saying if he asked his grandfather might have given him. Yang Chao stood up, saying it was pointless now since June clearly wanted Daya. June felt irritated, realizing his grandfather was deliberately teasing him. He said that no company could escape the currency crisis, and Daya would also need dollars. Without government subsidies, it would collapse. He added that he would then take it himself. Yang Chao frowned and said Daya was still a good company and only needed minimal help. That meant Daya and his son-in-law becoming mayor were interconnected. June smiled and said he would give the company his blood, turn his uncle into fertilizer, let the company bloom, and then rename it under Sang. The two stared at each other in silence. Yang Chao's expression shifted into something darker, a wicked joy forming as he said that besides himself, June was the only one in the family who truly aimed to increase Sang's subsidiaries. June froze, feeling discomfort as his grandfather's smile carried no warmth. Yang Chao said he needed time to think, but ordered June to move quickly because even the group presidents were restless and needed to be calmed once the $1 billion arrived. June bowed and left, feeling strangely unsettled. Yang Chao watched his grandson's back, deep in thought. The image formed clearly in his mind. A mayor selling state land under the pretense of saving the economy, acquiring a construction company, turning land into money, and doing it all while receiving $1 billion. Cheap, even at that exchange rate. He clenched his fist, realizing June had the confidence to secure hundreds of billions more. He admitted to himself that he had almost agreed instantly, and that frightened him. June was a predator, hiding the temperament of a tiger beneath a gentle face. One day, he would put Sang's name on Ain and Dyer alike. Later at the mansion, 3 cups sat on the table as the topic of 40 billion won arose. Uncle Choi explained the costs, special party fees, payouts to leaders, campaign expenses. June listened impassively, thinking 40 billion sounded like a dog's name. His uncle had no sense of scale. June said it was possible. Aunt Soyeon smiled sweetly, asking if June could provide 3 billion immediately. June agreed but said an agreement must be signed. His uncle laughed, saying no one signs contracts for election funds. June calmly replied that money without receipts still needed agreements. They dismissed him as a child with too much money. June didn't correct them. Instead, he called Sahan. When Sahan arrived, sharp in a tailored suit, the atmosphere shifted. He explained that once money became a business, fear replaced arrogance. He handed June a confidential contract, warning him never to use it until retirement or exile. June smiled, saying he would give it to his grandfather. Sahan panicked, but June explained calmly that the contract was a leash, not a weapon. Later, Sahan asked about control of Sang Group. June said his grandfather would give everything but his soul. Sang didn't understand. June explained that the chairman knew he was the only worthy manager, but greed and ego prevented him from giving power freely. Sang asked about his chances. June said he didn't know. When heart and mind fight, mind doesn't always win. He decided to treat inheritance as a bonus. Curious what happens next? Tap that cheeky bell, subscribe, like, and share.